much. The technician in
Yes.
the back was run around for the last half an hour trying to make things work.
Thank you very much. We are beyond our technical problems at this point, so I want to welcome you all today. I apologize for the delay. My name is Ed Getz. I'm the director of the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota, CURA. CURA is a research and outreach center at the university. And this is the Tom Scott Lecture Series. We created this lecture series in 2019, had one speaker, and then the pandemic hit. So this is the second speaker in the series of that was meant to be annually and will be annual in the future. Tom Scott was a longtime director of the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs for more than 4 decades. And so what our objective with this lecture series is to bring in scholars from across the country who are doing work of relevance and importance to this metropolitan area and this community as well. And that's why we're very pleased to welcome Professor Willow Lung-Amam, Associate Professor in Urban Studies and Planning at the University of Maryland, College Park. She received her PhD at Berkeley. She is the director of the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network. She's the director of the Urban Equity Collaborative at the University of Maryland. She's the director of community development at the National Center for Smart Growth, Research, and Education. Her research areas are in suburban development, poverty in the suburbs, racial segregation, immigration, gentrification, and the development and redevelopment of suburban areas as well. And she's going to talk today about her second book, which is called The Right to Suburbia, Combating Gentrification on the Urban Edge, published by the University of California Press. So let's have a nice warm welcome for Professor.
Thank you all so much. Thank you to Ed for the invitation, to Jonathan for helping to organize today, and for so many of you for coming out both in person and online. It's really nice to see some familiar faces and friends in the audience, and a real honor to be here to talk about my new book. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about the book itself, but I just want to say I start the book from a very personal angle and talking about coming back to the Washington, D.C. area. You were just asking where I live. Do I live in the D.C. suburbs? In fact, I don't live in the D.C. suburbs, but I have lived in 2 out of the 3 places that I will talk about today. I worked in 3 out of the 3 places that I will talk about today, and my family are native Washingtonians that have moved from the central city of Washington, D.C. to live in one of the suburbs that I will talk about today. So it is a very personal story to me. And I think for many of us, the scholarship that we do is not only about helping to combat forces that we see on the ground, but helping to combat forces that we've seen in our lives and our personal journeys. So it's a real honor to be able to share some of my work with you that has both a personal and professional journey involved. So hopefully, all right. So this book is about suburban gentrification. Let's see, okay. And so the first thing that I think about when I think about sort of talking about the suburbs and gentrification is, of course, why not? Why are we not talking about our metropolitan region when we're talking about issues of gentrification? But so much of the discourse about gentrification has emerged from studies of major urban centers, and what we've used to conceptually define what gentrification is and how it impacts communities have been so much focused on our urban centers that we rarely ask how and why it happens in other places as well. It's as if other places beyond the urban edge don't gentrify. These maps that I'm showing in this image show that, in fact, that's not true. The map on the far right is from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, which every several years puts out maps of metropolitan areas around the United States showing what communities have been gentrified or at risk of gentrification and who's being displaced, right? When they first started producing these maps, however, and I looked at the map of the DC region, it literally stopped at the borders of DC. It did not go beyond the DC border. So we couldn't actually even tell if areas beyond DC, the DC border, which if you look at the map here is the inverted rectangle here. So you literally didn't know whether areas outside of the DC border were gentrifying, but when they extended the map, lo and behold, you saw that there were not only areas that were eligible to gentrify in the DC suburbs, but in fact had gentrified. The other map is by a student of mine, associate professor now, Nick Finio, who did similar maps of the DC area and more clearly show that there are areas outside of the DC area that have gentrified, including places that I'm going to show you today. And I'm not going to get into a mapping and measuring debate for all the quanti scholars in the room about how we map and measure gentrification, but what we know is that there are places that in fact do gentrify in the American suburbs and in the DC region in particular. The other discourse that I engage in the book is a discourse around retrofitting suburbs. Our discourses about smart growth, right? Or discourses about the new urbanism, right? How suburbs are being made into more walkable, dense, and urban places. And this discourse is oftentimes celebratory in nature about, of course, we want to make our suburbs more good urban places, right? But we rarely talk about the consequences of this suburban redevelopment, who is being harmed in the process and what the impacts of these processes are. So what I'm trying to do in the book is both from the side of the gentrification scholars and from the side of sort of discourses about retrofitting our suburbs, trying to make an intervention into the ways in which we think about the ways in which communities can be harmed by these trends and how importantly communities are fighting back. So the Right to Suburbia investigates the battles that have been waged primarily by Black and Brown communities in the DC suburbs over the uneven cost and consequences of suburban redevelopment. So I look at 3 case studies in the Maryland suburbs that have undergone major redevelopment in the last several decades. And I ask how those who are most likely to bear the weight of suburbia's transformation have tried to balance the scales, to what extent that the processes and products of suburban redevelopment have disadvantaged already marginalized groups, and how have these groups mobilized to fight back for an equitable stake and place in their suburban futures. So I'm narrating from on the ground the experiences of activists, organizers, small businesses, and community leaders that have fought to resist the forces of gentrification and claim a more equitable stake in Suburbia's future. It's informed by about 70 in-depth interviews across these case studies, content analysis, mapping, data, and action research. As I mentioned, I have lived and worked in many of these places, but particularly the last place that I'll talk about today in most depth, the International Corridor. I've been involved with many of the groups that are fighting against displacement in this community. And I'll also say these are what I call connected case studies, in that what I'm really trying to describe in the book is an equitable development movement that is really emerging in the DC suburbs, and activist groups that began working in one of my case studies, you'll see reemerge in the second case study and even the third case study, because the organizers on the ground are learning from each other. They're adapting new tools, they're adapting new strategies, and building a bigger and broader coalition around anti-displacement in the DC suburbs. So the major argument of the book is that place matters, right? It matters in terms of the way we think about discourses of gentrification. And what I say, call the new suburban renewal, which has not simply added a prefix onto an old concept, but with new cast of characters at play and spatial dynamics, Suburbia has reshaped the urban redevelopment processes and politics. It's a unique brand of redevelopment that has, rather than alleviated the challenges of marginalized groups, but rather exacerbated some of the challenges that they face. And so I'll talk about today why place matters in suburbs in terms of sort of thinking about issues of gentrification in terms of suburbia's consolidated land uses that have often made redevelopment projects highly disruptive, its political fragmentation, that an increasing suburban segregation and sprawl that often isolates communities and renders the struggles of one neighborhood invisible and unconnected from another, how struggling suburbs often lack high capacity, established nonprofit and advocacy organizations that can engage residents in sustained redevelopment battles, and this organizing and coalition building that's often hampered in suburbs by its changing composition. Compared to some of the urban counterparts, like where I live in DC, these gentrifying suburbs tend to have more diverse residents dispersed across a larger area. Black and Latinx suburbanites, and particularly immigrants, lack well-established platforms for organizing and often hold less political power and representation than what they've built in decades of struggle in central cities. So when redevelopment arrives, residents in neighborhoods that are which were originally designed to exclude them face a real uphill battle in terms of building the politics and the policies they need to stay. They confront a dearth of anti-displacement policies, a lack of political will, and scant financial capital needed to create them. But just as marginalized groups have always done in American cities, they're fighting back in suburbs. So the Right to Suburbia reveals some of the vigorous organizing efforts that have emerged in one of the most rapidly and intensely gentrifying metropolitan regions in the United States. It talks about how groups have mobilized for their right to suburbia, in other words, their right to stay and put and to be the beneficiaries of new community investments and to define their own suburban dreams. So I have here a picture from a Black Lives Matter protest that happened in downtown Silver Spring, Maryland, which many of you don't know, but you will know by the end of today's presentation. And I put this picture here because so much of the way that we think about where the Black Lives Matter movement started, oftentimes our imagination goes to the urban centers, but as many of you know, Michael Brown died in the suburb of Ferguson outside of St. Louis. And if you know anything about the history of Ferguson, you know that it suffered from a history of disinvestment that actually led to the kind of vicious policing that you saw in Ferguson that led to the death of Michael Brown, that of course then catalyzed the Black Lives Matter movement that in fact started in Sanford, Florida, around the killing of a Black teen in a gated community. And so we see that a lot of the things that we think about as urban in nature, including police violence and including protest over racialized violence, actually has occurred in suburbs. And in fact, around the 2020 protests, more protests for Black Lives Matter actually in the DMV happened in the DC suburbs than they did in DC, where you saw the Black Lives Matter paint right in front of the Capitol. So this is about sort of decentering our ideas around racialized violence and around racialized protests. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my 3 case studies. I'll spend the most of the time on the last of these 3. But the first one is Silver Spring, which is one of the earliest examples of a dense suburban downtown in the DC metropolitan area. This was a suburb that sort of emerged in the late 19th century as an elite haven for wealthy Washingtonians who became some of its early community builders. There was then a rush of federal workers in the post-war period that helped Silver Spring become one of the region's first automobile suburbs and the downtown of the northern suburbs. But it was also highly restrictive. So the picture that you see down here in the bottom corner is Silver Spring downtown in the 1920s, when it was kind of the premier downtown for the northern suburbs of DC. The picture on the upper right-hand corner is that of Littonsville. Because downtown Silver Spring was highly restrictive with redlining, racial restrictive covenants, steering, and other racist real estate practices, African Americans were not only not allowed to live in downtown Silver Spring, they weren't allowed to sit in the restaurants or go to many of its stores. Most of the African Americans who went to downtown Silver Spring were working in the homes of wealthy white Washingtonians who had summer homes there. So instead, African Americans made a close-knit community literally across the tracks in the community of Littonsville, Maryland, a community that was established by freed slaves and later became the subject of multiple urban renewal projects and the dumping grounds for the county, who denied the community water and sewer services well into the 1980s. They fought, but they fought for fair housing and open accommodations, laws that eventually helped to open up not only downtown Silver Spring, but the rest of Montgomery County. But as African Americans made their way up out of DC, especially along the Georgia Avenue corridor, which I happen to live along, and pressed for access to suburbs in the 1960s and 70s, many white suburbanites, including those in downtown Silver Spring, began to move further out into the exurbs or fortify themselves within their middle-class residential enclaves. So especially after the 1968 uprisings in DC following the killing of Dr. Martin Luther King, many African American, especially middle class, began to move up this corridor, starting businesses and moving into some of the south and east apartment buildings in downtown Silver Spring. This period is kind of known by many in Montgomery County as a period of downtown Silver Spring's quote-unquote decline, right? You have many of the white middle class beginning to leave the community. You have many of the commercial businesses that used to occupy that central downtown moving further out into the suburbs as well. So there's this period where people associate with the so-called vacancy and decline, but mostly I think it's a lot of discomfort with the idea that there's a lot of immigrants and African Americans that are beginning to move into the neighborhood and contribute. And so when I talk to many county residents and county leaders about this period of time of the 1980s and early 1990s in downtown Silver Spring, I often heard this sort of cannonball metaphor, as if you could stand on Georgia Avenue and shoot a cannonball and literally not hit anyone in downtown Silver Spring because it was so vacant. But I think this perception of the high vacancy and the decline during the period is somewhat overblown. What it misses is this diverse mix of new suburbanites that really kept the downtown afloat during this period. African Americans were joined by a host of new immigrant communities, including a large East African population, primarily Ethiopian, who started businesses, played in these vacant sidewalks and parks, and built a sense of community. But their invisibility, as well as the sense of discomfort that their presence caused amongst the white civic and business leaders, prefaced the county's urgent calls for a need to redevelop the downtown and reestablish its rightful place in the county. So the fights over the redevelopment of downtown Silver Spring that began in the early 1990s were led by what I call Suburbia's old school activists, right? These are the traditional homeowners associations and civic associations and chambers of commerce that are more slow growth, exclusive growth, and more about sort of the privatized nature of the redevelopment that's happening. And the county begins to pour lots of dollars into making this kind of revitalization happen in downtown Silver Spring. So they began to purchase smaller parcels, assemble them, tear down vacant buildings, and clear the land. In 1993, they adopt a sector plan that's adding mixed uses and increasing densities in much of the downtown. They then put out calls, an RFP for major redevelopment proposals for the downtown. And this is just one of several that came in. This is for the quote unquote American Dream Mall, what one former council member called the Hershey Park in the middle of suburbia. It's a 27-acre mega mall with an entertainment complex and an indoor roller coaster. It was proposed by the developers of the Mall of America. Very good. Something that you all know very well about. But actually didn't get built in downtown Silver Spring, but kind of represents some of the kind of push for redevelopment that you see happening during this period. What you don't see is what I call the quiet storm, this definitive toll on affordable housing and small businesses that happens in downtown Silver Spring during the period, a period of both direct and indirect displacement. So you see by the early 2000s, housing prices beginning to rise quickly in the downtown. You see small businesses that are bearing the brunt of these impacts. There's just direct displacement that happens because of eminent domain, construction disruption, and rising rents and speculative leasing practices that happen in the core of downtown Silver Spring. And then you see the kind of indirect displacement that happens with reduced foot traffic and competition from national chains that begin to move into the downtown. But while some of these traditional old school activists continue to rally for their vision of suburban redevelopment, you also begin to see a new type of activism emerge among new immigrants, communities of color, and other historically marginalized groups from the process. Those groups that I call the new school activists. So under the umbrella of a newly formulated organization called Impact Silver Spring, you see the equitable development movement in the DC suburbs begin to coalesce for one of the first times in the DC region over the fate of downtown Silver Spring. So Impact Silver Spring was really born out of the frustrations over a lack of diversity in the redevelopment process. Its president, Frankie Blackburn, was originally appointed to the Silver Spring Redevelopment Committee. She was a former director of public housing in the county, and she was really bothered by the lack of diversity that she saw on the leadership and attention to affordable housing issues more broadly in the downtown Silver Spring redevelopment. So she began Impact Silver Spring as an organization to train and support diverse leaders to get engaged with county boards and agencies about issues of redevelopment. And they began activism around downtown Silver Spring, fighting for more affordable housing protections and protections for small businesses in downtown. But their efforts were hamstrung by this new organization that had capacity issues. They came about a little bit too late in the redevelopment process to have really significant impacts on what happened in downtown Silver Spring. The county does eventually respond to some of their demands and sponsors the county's first impact assistance bill for businesses that are impacted directly by the county-led redevelopment. But again, this process comes about a little bit too late after many of the downtown businesses in Silver Spring has already been relocated or closed in downtown to actually have an impact. I will mention that it is important here that this legislation that happens in downtown Silver Spring was driven by Tom Perez, who was the first Latino on the county council and the former head of Casa de Maryland, a group that will show up a little later in my story, an important immigrant rights group in the county that was just getting started at the time. So in essence, downtown Silver Spring is the story about sort of one of the early activisms that happens over the redevelopment of the DC suburbs, but one which I think is a mixed story of success, because we do get one of these important legislations that ends up protecting more small businesses later down the line, and a story of an important organization, Impact Silver Spring, that continues to exist today, but came about a little bit too late in terms of helping to actually establish more affordable housing protections for downtown Silver Spring during this critical period of redevelopment. Silver Spring today is touted as one of the largest urban renewal efforts ever taken by the state of Maryland. and widely considered one of its most successful, a model of suburban retrofit across the United States. It is touted as one of the most ethnically diverse communities in the United States, but I would argue that these harsh realities have been undergirded this so-called successful story. A lot of people say even today that Silver Spring, which is my downtown, I can literally walk to it from my house, is more ethnically than economically diverse, and that disparities in income continue to grow. It's a highly segregated community, and there are ongoing racial tensions in the community that I think can be traced back to these early fights over redevelopment in downtown Silver Spring. There's also continuing pressures around affordable housing and small businesses, including revitalization plans for Fenton Village, which is the area that many of the small businesses that were relocated from the core of downtown Silver Spring were relocated to, and now some of those areas are redeveloping today as well. So this case is one in which the organizing, both from the bottom and from the top, that once spurred greater engagement of this diverse community and the policies has also waned a bit in the face of ongoing redevelopment in the community. So that's the first case of downtown Silver Spring. Now I want to go further up Georgia Avenue, which is only about 2 miles up the Georgia Avenue corridor, to the community of Wheaton, Maryland. So Wheaton is sort of the next stop on the DC Metro if you go up the Red Line. So it's not at all far from downtown Silver Spring. It is the place where a lot of the downtown businesses that once left downtown Silver Spring moved to new shopping malls in Wheaton that were being developed, because sort of development just sort of hopscotched out to the next suburb. So a lot of the businesses that left went to the Wheaton community. The Wheaton community was a community that was largely built out, again, as a white middle-class suburb, this time with a lot of VA loans for returning veterans, and becomes another center of the county's diversity. For many of you, if you know Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C.'s, in downtown Washington, D.C., there's a community known as Adams Morgan, and it's known as the intersection of the historically African-American community and the Latinx community. And Wheaton today is known as the Little Adams Morgan, right? Because it's this eclectic mix of both residents and small businesses that occupy Wheaton today. But its redevelopment story continues to demonstrate the dense layers and complex forms of public planning, investment, and subsidy that makes suburban renewal both possible and profitable. It highlights the critical nexus of neoliberal suburban public policies in transforming disinvested communities through public-private partnerships, and how county-led redevelopment often clears the way for private development and private investment and gain. But just as in downtown Silver Spring, we'll see how, though redevelopment is slow to get off the ground, the power of the public purse and policy make it both proceed at a fast clip, but we'll also see how suburban organizing groups have organized to combat these trends. And so I'll talk here about, again, these new school suburban activists begin to organize in Wheaton, particularly around the loss of many of these small businesses, immigrant and BIPOC-owned small businesses in the downtown. So unlike downtown Silver Spring, where I would say that the politics over redevelopment were really driven by old school suburban activists, as I described before, new school activists in Wheaton were more of a force from the beginning. Some sat on redevelopment boards and committees, and others headed local civic organizations that rallied for suburban redevelopment in downtown Silver Spring. Unlike their old school counterparts, their interests were really in redevelopment that was not simply around historic preservation or protecting their Sylvan middle class communities. It was more about how more of the residents were intertwined with the interest of keeping Wheaton diverse and its multicultural character intact. So they fought for project that was more inclusive process of redevelopment and vision from the outset. But suburban boosters, including many elected representatives, developers, sought to really capitalize off this visible expression of difference in the landscape. Wheaton's ethnic, retail, and cultural spaces really served as a kind of symbolic capital that they thought they could exploit in the redevelopment process. So you see this kind of tension between what diversity actually means and how it plays out in the case of Wheaton. While acknowledging that Wheaton as a multi-ethnic community, both New School and suburban boosters really rallied around visions of redevelopment that continued, however, to leave many voices out and obscured what I would call the actually existing diversity of residents in Wheaton and the protections that were really needed by the most vulnerable residents, including many Latinx and immigrant residents and businesses. So again, we see a new group coming to the fore to really argue for greater protections for these businesses and residents in the case of in the case of Wheaton. This is a banner from the Coalition for Fair Redevelopment group, a group that was led by the Latino Economic Development Corporation. Latino Economic Development Corporation is a 50-year-old organization that grew up in DC, working largely in the Adams Morgan and Columbia Heights area, working with residents and small businesses around protecting community and economic development interest in those communities and really helping to organize businesses in those communities. It's a very established organization. And when redevelopment begins in Wheaton, they move initially one person into their new suburban offices in downtown Wheaton. This is the first time this organization is working in the DC suburbs. And they start working with businesses because they're brought in by the county to provide some technical assistance to these businesses. And they begin talking to businesses and they're like, why are we providing technical assistance to businesses that are actually going to be displaced by the county-led redevelopment that's happening in this community? And so they actually begin to organize those businesses and then launch the Fair Redevelopment Coalition alongside other organizations, including Impact Silver Spring that worked in downtown, to begin to call for a community benefits agreement and larger protections, not only for small businesses, but residents in the Wheaton community. So this is, again, demonstrating the county's consistent role in spurring large-scale redevelopments. So in downtown Silver Spring, you had a county executive, Doug Duncan, who came in and said, this is going to be my redevelopment project. I'm going to make sure that downtown Silver Spring redevelops and is a success. Then his successor, Ike Leggett, comes in and says, oh, he didn't do a good job at protecting small businesses or the kind of redevelopment that we want to see in the county. My legacy is going to be in downtown Wheaton. So both county executives pour hundreds of millions of dollars into making these redevelopments happen. We see similar tactics across both communities of assembling parcels, RFPs, multiple development proposals, lots of county dollars coming in to support these projects. But what we don't see is substantive investments in low-income housing and protections for small businesses and otherwise. All right. So some things were accomplished in downtown Silver Spring. The Latino Economic Development Corporation, who starts this Fair Redevelopment Coalition and this fight for a community benefits agreement through various versions of proposals over downtown Wheaton, never come to the fore. But what they are able to do is to reactivate this tool that was born out of the fights in downtown Silver Spring, this impact assistance program, to really support the small businesses in Wheaton. So many of these small businesses still exist today because of that tool that was fought for in downtown Silver Spring. It actually gets funded and used in downtown Wheaton to protect many of those small businesses. So that is a success. The other success is that the county council member, Nancy Navarro, who's the first Latina on the Montgomery County Council comes to the fore. She's the one who proposes the reauthorization of this small impact assistance bill, make sure it's funded, make sure it's actually helping the businesses and small businesses in Wheaton, increases the amount of affordable housing in the downtown on the county parcels of land, and provides other protections around county services and others in the downtown. So while this larger goal that the Fair Redevelopment Coalition fought for does not come to fore in the case of Wheaton, you do get some protections in place, and importantly because you have county leaders that are willing and working with the grassroots in order to make these visions come to the fore. So I would say that Wheaton overall is a case of sort of one step forward from what we saw in the case of downtown Silver Spring, where we're actually seeing some more tools come to fore and be activated. But again, you see this kind of hamstrung capacity of the grassroots, especially, as I told you, one organizer working for the Latino Economic Development Corporation, who is no longer really taking an active role in building and keeping this coalition alive as redevelopment has really come about. The last case that I'm going to talk about is the community of Langley Park in this larger international corridor, which is the community that has the largest immigrant and Latino presence in the DC area. And this is an area where a new light rail is being built, known as the Purple Line, and where many of the immigrant-owned businesses and the housing, affordable housing, a lot of market rate affordable housing, is currently being lost around the building out of this new light rail line. So what is known as the Purple Line, which is still being built in the Maryland suburbs, it broke ground in 2017. We're now in 2025, so it's been being built for the last 8 years in the DC suburbs. This is a $5.6 billion 16-mile light rail line that's going to go all the way from Montgomery County, which is where downtown Silver Spring and Wheaton are, into Prince George's County, which is where the University of Maryland College Park is. And it's going to connect into all the metro stops on the Red Line, or some of the metro stops. So it's going to be the first intersuburban light rail line that we have in the DC metro system, and going to connect some of our highest income suburbs to some of our lowest income suburbs. So this new light rail line has raised all kinds of possibilities and hope, especially on the eastern side of the line, for the new opportunities that it might raise for communities that have been disinvested and lacked opportunity, but is also raising acute threats over the displacement, especially in the community of Langley Park. So I'm showing this image of Langley Park just to give you a brief sense of its history, which went from the post-war period of predominantly white working class community, a lot of Jewish residents in the community, to become a predominantly African-American community in the 70s and 80s, before it became host to a haven of South Asian immigrant communities, particularly Indians, and then today is the heart of the Latinx immigrant community in the DC area, and predominantly Guatemalan and Salvadoran population. So La Union Mall, which you see on the right, and that's what it looks like today, in the 1980s was known as Asian Town. So it is what I would call an arrival suburb, which in the last several decades, many immigrants have really settled in this area from Central American and South American populations, the Caribbean, Asia, Africa. It has roughly a population of about 21,000 residents, 2/3 of whom are foreign born, 82% of which are Latinx, an overwhelming amount of new arrivals from Central America, has one of the largest concentration of undocumented Latinx populations in Prince George's County, with many people arriving for economic opportunity. It's disproportionately young and male. Household averages around 4 people, which is 1 point higher than the county, but this includes many unrelated and related individuals that crowd into apartments in order to make the rent, low levels of education and English proficiency, adults often working in low-wage and low-skilled positions outside of the formal labor market, holding intermittent, part-time, and seasonal jobs with few benefits, working multiple jobs to make ends meet. Most of the men are employed in construction or as day laborers. Poverty rates here are high. Household incomes are low. Nearly 1/2 of residents earn below the DC median income, and 1 in 6 residents live below the poverty line, though I think these numbers are slightly inflated because of the way households are defined. And the Langley Park community also lacks a lot of quality, affordable housing. About 4 in 5 out-of-resident households rent rather than own homes in the community, and over half pay more than 30% of their household income on rent, which, as we know, is a common indicator of affordability. Despite all that, Langley Park is a strong and connected community. Many low-income residents holds strong social capital, often relying on each other for everyday support and assistance from carpools and childcare. And so their strong, tight social networks really help to sustain a strong sense of community in this neighborhood. But as I mentioned, this is an area where the Purple Line is going to intersect. I mentioned that disparity that you see between the West Side and East Side communities. This map really shows it. If you're able to read this section to the far left is the Bethesda-Chevy Chase area, and shows that the population density is relatively low in that community, but the job opportunities are really high. This is one of our favorite quarters in terms of the jobs. The median household is really high. A very low percentage of the population actually uses public transportation. Most people just commute to work or work at home, right? But then the non-white population is really low. But as you move to the east side, and especially in the international corridor, those demographics change dramatically. So you see a very high population density, a very low job density, a very low median household income, a very high population that is reliant on public transportation, but there's currently nothing but buses that go through this community, and a very high non-white population. So when you talk about who the Purple Line is actually going to benefit, it is probably going to benefit the East Side communities more than the West Side communities. And so the West Side communities have been very adamant that they don't really want nor need the Purple Line, which is why it's taken 8 years plus to build, because they've raised everything from lawsuits over endangered species and the loss of their golf course to walking trails and many environmental complaints over the Purple Line. This is really a community at the crossroads. It is literally called the Langley Park Crossroads because it sits at the intersection of 2 counties, Montgomery County and Prince George's County, but it's also a community at the crossroads in the sense that the community will likely be highly impacted from having 2 light rail stations directly in the center of the community, and nearly all of the population is within a quarter-mile walking radius of those Purple Line stations. So it has the capacity to dramatically change the trajectory of this community. When Purple Line discussions first started happening in 2009, actually, a long time ago, the communities of Bethesda and Chevy Chase were coming out in very large numbers to complain about the walking trails and their endangered species, and put the whole Purple Line at threat. In Casa de Maryland, this organization that I mentioned earlier in the case of Wheaton, but had actually been involved in the case of downtown Silver Spring as well, actually have their headquarters in Langley Park. And by this time, well, in the other cases, they were a growing immigrant rights organization. By the time of the Purple Line, they're actually the largest immigrant rights organization in the state of Maryland and in the Mid-Atlantic region. So they're a growing organization, and they're based right in Langley Park. And so they start activating around the Purple Line because they see that all these West Side communities are coming out, and the East Side communities, and particularly the international corridor, is not represented at all. So they start what is known as the Fair Development Coalition, began organizing with grassroots organizations within the international corridor to build organization that calls for yet another community benefits agreement, this time a corridor-wide community benefits agreement that's known as the Purple Line Corridor Compact. This agreement, unfortunately, does not get signed. A new governor gets elected to the state of Maryland, Larry Hogan, who says that they're going to pull the state dollars out of the Purple Line altogether, and it's just going to be funded by the county. But importantly, he's pulling all commitments that had been negotiated by these grassroots and grass tops coalitions around the state support for this community benefits agreement out of the Purple Line. So essentially, what we have today is called the community development agreement. It's a non-binding agreement between the two counties that is supporting the goals that the Fair Redevelopment Coalition and a new coalition that emerges in 2013 known as the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, which is based out of the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education, which is where I sit, emerges to really fight for a set of principles around the protection of affordable housing, around the preservation of small businesses, around neighborhood investments in these communities, and around interjurisdictional planning across these two county lines to ensure that those most impacted communities are actually protected. And so that's what we have today. It's a voluntary agreement, but these two coalitions, the Fair Development Coalition and the Purple Line Coalition, have really pushed for many of the things that have made the Purple Line planning a success and made some of those impacts that could have happened and are still potentially happening in the international corridor. It has mediated some of those impacts. So let me briefly talk about some of the things that they have done, and then I will close because I know we're running a little short on time and I want to make sure to have time for discussion. So planning across county lines, I mentioned that the international corridor is really spanning two counties. So some of the things that the Purple Line Corridor Coalition and FDC have pushed for is really interjurisdictional planning. They pushed to make sure that the sector plans of the two counties spoke to one another because they each have a Tacoma-Langley Crossroads sector plan, and those two plans initially didn't look anything similar. They still don't today, I will say, but they were, for instance, on the Prince George's County, on the Montgomery County side, there's a commitment to no net less of affordable housing. On the Prince George's County side, we don't have that commitment at all, but they pushed for greater conversations amongst the counties and greater protections on both sides to make sure that the plans spoke to one another. They have made some protections in terms of protecting naturally occurring affordable housing. All the housing in Langley Park is largely this kind of naturally occurring affordable housing with no permanent protections for affordable housing. So they focused on having more protections for Montgomery County, for instance, more widespread information about leases, a standard lease. They've pushed for the county to intervene on the loss of some of these naturally occurring affordable housing. In Montgomery County, you have one of the oldest inclusionary zoning programs in the United States, and on the Prince George's side, you have no inclusionary zoning at all, but they have pushed for a inclusionary zoning pilot around the Langley Park area that will just protect some of the affordable housing in that area. They've also done a lot around code enforcement because many of this naturally occurring affordable housing is actually in really, really poor condition. It's really slumlord housing because the county on the Prince George's County side has done nothing to enforce code enforcement. So they've put in place new protections for code enforcement to upgrade the ability of this house, the quality of this housing, so that nonprofit housing developers can take over the housing. Because right now, when I talk to nonprofit developers, they're like, "We're not touching that housing because we can't be slumlords." And they've also passed in Prince George's County a tenant opportunity to purchase act, which they had in Montgomery County. previously, and they now have on the Prince George's County side, and they're pushing to actually make sure that's funded and that nonprofits are able to take control of that housing. So there's been some great things that have happened in terms of housing and small business. Many of these businesses, they have provided technical assistance and loans to both PLCC and FDC, pushed for a lot of the contracting along the Purple Line to go to local businesses. They pushed for open for business signs and open during construction, though I will say along the international corridor, it hasn't made much difference because the streets have literally been ripped up for the last 3 years. But they've pushed for having direct technical assistance inside of the community. And the PLCC recently won a $2 million grant with FTA to provide economic development strategy for the area. So that's some of the wins there. And around community engagement in suburbs is so difficult because sometimes these communities are so dispersed and so diverse, as I mentioned, but these community groups have really pushed for engagement of these groups. So CASA, for instance, runs vans sometimes when there's community meetings through the community to literally pick up residents who don't own cars to make sure that they're coming out to county and state engagement meetings to make sure that more protections are put on the line. But still, there's a lot of struggle to go. The Purple Line is not proposed to be complete until 2026. And so a lot of these protections are still yet to be seen because we actually haven't seen, you've seen upzoning in the Langley Park area, but you haven't seen yet what is actually going to take place. So there's a lot of protections that are still needed and a lot of coalition building that is still needed to make sure that this community is protected. I put this picture here because it actually shows that the Purple Line is not going to only affect the community of Langley Park, but is going to go all the way through to downtown Silver Spring, to that Fenton Village area that I talked about, where many of the businesses that had originally been displaced from downtown Silver Spring were relocated into this area that now has a new sector plan, now is planning to redevelop and as densifying, and now has a new Purple Line coming through as well. So it's really a story of ongoing redevelopment, not a one-time redevelopment, and how activists and community groups sustain this fight that happens over redevelopment over several decades, right? How do we build the capacity of these groups to really sustain the fight and really activate communities in times of need? Because obviously redevelopment is not just a one-time tale. All right, so in wrapping up, this famous quote from the Marxist geographer David Harvey about the right to the city, right, is one that we oftentimes think about as literally the city, right, the urban downtown core of our area. Is about the right to the city is a right to change ourselves by changing the city that depends on the exercise of a collective power to reshape processes of urbanization. And I ask what that would look like or should look like in the suburbs. So in my concluding chapter, I talk about how we sort of displace this idea of the urban in our discourses around gentrification, that gentrification actually knows no municipal bounds, that suburbs have and can gentrify, and they really make little distinction between our geographies, whether inner or outer suburbs. This idea around the new suburban renewal is not really new. In my history chapter, I really dig into the sort of ways in which, like, many of the patterns that we see, whether redlining or racial covenants or urban renewal, have really happened in our suburbs as well. And so how those distinctions between urban and suburban have never really been that meaningful. But especially now as communities move back to the suburbs and we get these more policies around more dense mixed-use walkable suburbs, how we really need to be able to name what is happening in the suburbs as being really important and contest some of this kind of rhetoric that our suburban retrofit policies or smart growth policies, our new urbanist policies aren't really having detrimental impacts. Right, so we need to sort of be able to contest this this discourse, we need to really think about why place matters. I mentioned at the beginning these ways in which I think place matters substantially in the suburbs, from the way that spatial divides and private profits, maybe sort of thinking about the land use side, right? How redevelopment can be really highly disruptive in suburbs, as we saw across all these 3 case studies, because you have large blocks of singular use land that is receiving a lot of county and state dollars to see wholesale redevelopment. But yet how stubborn many of these communities are to change because of the single land uses that they've been developed around. And so it really requires that strong hand of the county and the state in order to make redevelopment happen. And that's why actually I started the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network, because so many of the places that I was seeing were seeing wholesale redevelopment, especially of areas that were originally zoned for only commercial use. And now we're trying to add mixed use. We're trying to add housing. You don't really see this as much in urban centers that have always been mixed use. But where you really see the impacts in many of the communities that I have seen is around the small businesses. I talk about how we need to support the organizing from the ground up, this lack of organizations that you see, including the nonprofits that are working on the ground in these communities, the social service providers, but especially the advocates and the organizing capacity that you really don't see very much of in the suburbs. But how many of and how strong that will of the old school activists that I described in the downtown Silver Spring chapter is, how many of these we need to be supporting diverse and dispersed communities and really building out the tools of advocacy from, say, the small business development side. Many small businesses are not organized into business associations, or there's, for instance, in Langley Park, there's only one tenants association that CASA just started a few years ago. So there's really this lack of organizing vehicles that happens in suburbs and the capacity that really needs to be built. Alongside the political representation in every case that I just showed, the people on the elected side that really brought the concerns of the grassroots to the grass tops were the first and the onlys in their communities. They were the first Latinos on the county council in both Montgomery and Prince George's County that's really bringing these tools to the fore. But our political representation is really lacking in many of these places to really bring these concerns to the fore. And importantly, the toolkit, the anti-displacement toolkit. This is where I spend a lot of my time as a leader of the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network, but in many of these suburban municipalities, we're lacking rent control. We're lacking tools like code enforcement. We're lacking the tools of inclusionary zoning, tools that have been built in our urban centers over decades of struggle. We're seeing being built for the first time in many of our suburban communities. And then we have to figure out not only how to build the tool, but then how to make it work for the populations that really need it the most in a very timely way. So these are the kind of challenges that we face today, and why we need to really invest in making helping communities to envision new suburban futures in which they not only stay put, but have a voice and a say in their own community. Thank you.
And then this will be and briefly introduce yourself.
Sure. Okay, my name's Madeline. Is this on? Okay. My name's Madeline. I'm a student here at the Humphrey School. Thanks for your talk. It was really, really interesting. I'm wondering whether the small businesses that you're talking about are mostly like tenants in a larger building, or if they own their buildings, and what effect that might have on the displacement, and also whether when you're talking about displacement, you mean like, I want to stay in this exact shop, exact building, or like I just want to stay on the same street and in the same area, but I would be okay with moving or with being in a newer building when the new building like shows up, if that makes sense.
In most of the cases, the small businesses do not own their buildings. Ownership is key to being able to remain in place. But many of the small businesses do not. In downtown Silver Spring, I did speak to an owner that did own her building, and she was able to remain in place. But many of the businesses who don't, they're just subject to the whims of their landlords that have put some pretty predatory practices in place. So ownership is definitely a strategy, one that we spent a whole year on, community ownership policies with the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network, because it is such an important tool, but one that unfortunately not a lot of businesses have. And so the question about displacement and how displacement is measured or how people think about it, I talked about in the case of Silver Spring, both direct and indirect displacement. Direct displacement being your rent goes up and you can't afford it, or the county comes and takes the building, knocks it down, assembles parcels. Those are direct forms of displacement. Indirect displacement could be, just losing business, and eventually your business has to close. Most of the businesses that I've talked to or that advocates have talked about, they're really committed to staying in the community and serving this community. It's not necessarily that they have to be on this particular street. Most of the businesses are there because the residents are there, right? They're there to serve the communities that, frequent their businesses. So the Latino community, the Latino serving businesses in the Wheaton community largely serve the Latino community in Wheaton. So this issue of affordable housing and affordable small business space is really an important mix for both keep the residents in place and keep the small businesses in place, because they're really serving each other. Similarly, in Langley Park, residents say, really, I could move somewhere else, but my community is here. And even though it's a very unwalkable community, because there are major state highways that go down both sides of the street in Langley Park, most of the residents say they want to live in Langley Park because that is their community. And that's a large part because of the small businesses that are there and serve the businesses with products from their home countries and a real strong sense of community.
Hi, my name is Will. Also a student here at the Humphrey School. I grew up in Bethesda Chevy Chase, very familiar with the issues you're talking about, and selfishly want to ask a question. This summer, I'll be working with LISC DC on their Blue Line Corridor Coalition, which is kind of, I don't want to say, I don't know enough about it to say it's the opposite of the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, but it kind of is, in which they're trying to spur development there in Prince George's County. And so I'm wondering, in places, with high vacancy rates now, struggling immigrant and Black owned businesses, how does your framework kind of fit in there, and what anti-displacement kind of policies can you advocate for in advance of potential gentrification? Or not, they're moving the, Commanders, the football team stadium, potentially to DC, which will further kind of impact the investment in that community. So yeah, could you just talk about all?
Yeah. Great. It's nice to have somebody who recognizes the geography that I'm talking about. I would say that the Purple Line Corridor Coalition is a good example to look at, because they really started activating well before the Purple Line started to be built. They understood that displacement happens both before, during, and after redevelopment comes to town. And if the protections are not in place before, then there's not going to be protections for this community afterwards. And so as long as the Purple Line is taken to be built, as I said, it started in 2017. 8 years later, it's still not built, largely because of your community, sorry to say. But in some ways that has actually been good, say the activists, because it has slowed down the development process and given them time to negotiate some important protections and some important investments. But meanwhile, it has disrupted a lot of the small businesses in the meantime. So it's a little bit of a catch-22, but I would say that the purple line is a good example. The other thing I'll say about the blue line is that some of the Prince George's County policies have really been about attracting larger scale development. So there's this big fight in the region about, Bethesda being Chevy Chase being the favored quarters, and where all of the chain retailers and all of the big business goes to in Prince George's County, because it's a largely an African American county, doesn't get the white tablecloth restaurants and the economic growth that it needs. So when it comes to economic development policy in the county is oftentimes touting the need for higher end businesses, higher growth kind of economic development opportunities that is not really serving some of the lower income Black and brown communities as much. And so it's a little bit, it's a struggle in terms of defining really what equitable growth and development will look like in Prince George's County and along the Blue Line in particular.
Thanks so much. I'm Valentine Cadieux, and I know this geography, but not as a planner. So this may or may not be a relevant question, but especially given what you just said, I'm curious about the role of instruments like tax increment financing and how that ends up playing into the policymakers' view of what equitable development looks like.
Yeah, I don't believe that any of these are TIF districts. So tax increment financing is a really convoluted thing that I won't try to explain, but is a way of investing in redevelopment, but has mixed reviews in terms of its ability to really act as an anti-displacement tool. I will say for the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network, we do put it in our toolkit as one that can act as an anti-displacement tool, but we had a lot of arguments about whether or not it should go into the anti-displacement tool, because it's sometimes used as a displacement tool or can serve as a means of displacement. So I think they have to be really intentional about who those tax credits go to and how the benefits are actually returned to the community in the case of TIF districts, but I don't think any of these are.
Thank you for your talk. You've accumulated a great deal of information, and it's a challenge to outline it comprehensively. So I appreciate that you put it into a book. I'm Steve Peterson. I'm a senior, and but I take classes at the Humphrey School. One local comment. I believe that during the time he was in the Senate, Hubert Humphrey lived in Chevy Chase. So, and we're in his building now. Otherwise, it's regrettable that that gentrification seems to be displacement, and because that seems to be the subject that you're dealing with. And I'm mystified by the term naturally occurring affordable housing. That sounds like market rate housing.
Exactly. Those two terms are relatively interchangeable: market rate affordable housing or naturally occurring affordable housing. But I think it's more of a suburban condition than an urban condition, that we see more oftentimes that this housing stock that is considered affordable because it is within range for those who meet a certain threshold of income is by the market is considered affordable, but there's no permanent protections. There's no tax credits. There's no public housing. There's no other protections that keep this housing stock affordable. So when we talk about the threats to the Langley Park community with such a wide swath of the community in this market rate affordable housing category, you can also, and most of Langley Park, well, it's 21,000 residents, it's only about 14 complexes, and those 14 complexes are owned by about 7 landlords. I do. I'm sorry, do I think that rent control is a long-term solution? I do. I live in Washington, D.C., where we have rent control. It has protected a lot of renters from being displaced in one of the most intensely gentrifying areas of the country. It is not the only solution that we need in the toolkit, but it is an increasingly important one, and it is one that many suburban municipalities are not even willing to consider, including Prince George's County, which has had a rent control study that has been largely ignored by the county.
Hi, I'm Lee Gagazian. I work at Cura. Thanks for your talk. A lot of what you said resonated with some of the organizing we've seen along, I'll stand up, I'm short, the Blue Line extension. And I think we've seen, or I've seen in North Minneapolis or more central city neighborhoods, the role of historic ties to place and collective memory in organizing wins. And that, as you've mentioned and said, like place matters. So how do you create, or how have you observed communities creating a sense of collective belonging or building power together in a rival suburbs where they may not have the same historic ties to place that we see in central city neighborhoods?
That is such a good question. And I think that's a true challenge, because many of these places are places that communities, while they have lived there since the 1980s or 90s, this is not like long, deep roots in these communities. And it's very diverse communities that are staking claim to these communities. And so it's really hard to reach back to a historic or cultural center in many of these places as a tool for organizing. And so that has been a real challenge in many of these communities, because you don't have only one group, right? And even in the case of Langley Park, where you have the largest Latinx and immigrant community, it's also got a large French-speaking African community, a large Caribbean community. And so you have a Latino-led organization that's reaching out in the community, but is not representing everyone. When Impact Silver Spring started organizing, I talked to Frankie Blackburn, who was the main organizer and the leader of Impact Silver Spring. She was like, I have no idea how to reach out to Ethiopian immigrants in these apartment buildings that I'm trying to organize. And then I go knock on the next door and it's a South Asian immigrant. And so like the organizing is just so difficult in these communities, and there's not a historic core or a common narrative to link back to in terms of what this community means to these diverse groups. And so I think that has been one of a primary issue in terms of the organizing, in addition to the lack of organizing vehicles.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Mark Jenkins. Just to pile on, I'm a former resident of Gaithersburg. My question goes to the fact that we're talking about issues, including transit, that cross city and county borders.
Yeah.
In the Twin Cities, it's called the Metropolitan Council. In Washington, I think it's the Washington Area Coalition of Governments.
Council of Governments.
How can they be involved, or are they, to help bring all of these communities together on common issues?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't really have regional governance. We don't have areas with strong, powerful regional organizations. Well, these are like coordinating vehicles, but they don't have any legislative authority to actually, push new policies. So it's all based upon what the counties elect. to do, and they're really just a coordinating body. So in the case of Washington, D.C., I've seen very little of the Washington Council of Governments involvement with these issues, but in terms of coordinating, their role is really to convene rather than to really push new policy, from what I've seen.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lung-Amam. I appreciate your talk today. There were so many echoes of our local situation in what we heard from you about the challenges of dealing with displacement along transit lines in suburban communities as well. So thank you very much for your presentation, and please everyone join me in a round of thanks.